What do you need help with?
Is a deceased person.
A murder mystery that has a potential connection to a terrorist attack hundreds of miles away. We have newly released evidence photos connected to a shocking case.
What happened?
Gunshot.
And what's your relationship to this person?
Domestic partner.
This man called 911 saying that he found his girlfriend dead, but police say he's the one who pulled the trigger. And in a shocking twist, how this story and this victim potentially set in motion a plan that led to a bombing. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. This story out of Washington State begins in a way that so many sadly do, with a phone call to 911 dispatchers. Now, before I play the audio for you, I want you to meet one of the people at the center of this case. His name is Lars Nelson, and according to his LinkedIn, he worked as a software engineer, and court records show that at one point he worked for Amazon. Nelson lives in Fox Island, Washington. It is a beautiful island off the city of Tacoma in the Pacific Northwest. Nelson lived with his girlfriend inside a home along this road not far from the water. It's a home that was owned by his dad. On April 20th, around 6:30 in the morning, dispatchers received a call from Lars Nelson.
What do you need help with?
Is a deceased person.
Lars called claiming that he found his girlfriend dead inside their house, and you can hear the nerves in his voice.
What happened?
Gunshot.
And what's your relationship to this person?
Domestic partner.
Lars claimed that his girlfriend named Sophie Tinney had died by a gunshot wound to the head.
And are you sure they're past the point of saving?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know when this happened?
Just now. Just a few moments ago.
Okay, and where's the firearm?
I've removed the clip. It is sitting on the bed next to her. Dad.
And you cleared the firearm and removed the clip?
Yes, I did. Dad.
Okay, and what's your partner's last name?
Tinney. Tinney.
First
name, Sophie, Sophie.
Lars claimed that Sophie had taken her own life.
And you have no idea where she shot herself?
In the head.
Okay. Is there anyone else there with you?
Just my father.
Okay. Where is he now?
He was just standing next to me. He just went back over. I think he's checking on the dogs. Or he's right back here.
Okay. And are you in the main house on the property?
The two of us are currently in the driveway of the property.
Okay, where's she located?
In the large red building, top floor.
Before we get back to this story out of Washington State, I want to bring you a Law&Crime legal alert, because if you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and were later diagnosed with a brain or a spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Our partners at Morgan & Morgan are investigating claims that patients were not properly warned about this risk. It is free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description to this video. You can also go to www.forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. Lars said that Sophie had been having some mental health struggles and continues to say that this was something that she did to herself. I want you to listen to how he answers this question from the dispatcher, though, about whether Sophie was struggling recently.
I have her phone with me. I believe that there may be recordings on it that may be relevant.
All he would say is that he has some recordings, a very veiled, ominous answer to that question. But there were some other calls that had come into dispatchers that in some ways had backed up Lars' story.
Knock Communications, how can I help you?
Hi, my name is... I called a little while ago about a friend who's threatening to kill herself in a park.
Sophie's mom also called dispatchers asking for a wellness check after she said that she had talked to her daughter for 6 hours the day before.
Communications, may I help you?
I was just wondering what the status was on the update of my daughter for a wellness check.
But when police arrived at the house on Fox Island, court documents show that the story Lars gave did not add up. Here are some pictures of some of the evidence that deputies took. According to an arrest affidavit, deputies say they found 3 9mm casings and a Glock handgun. You might remember in that 911 call that you heard, Lars told the dispatcher that Sophie died by a gunshot, not plural. Deputies say not only did they find those 3 spent shell casings, they also found 3 areas where it appeared she had been hit by gunfire. Deputies write, quote, her head was lying on a pillow with 3 visible defects upon examination. The furthest west defect contained what appeared to be hair belonging to Sophie Tinney. Deputies noted that between the casings and the gunshot wounds, it wasn't possible that Tinney would have been the person pulling the trigger. Lars was booked on second-degree murder. Here are some pictures of him after the arrest. Deputies also noted that when they arrived at the Nelsons' house, they asked if they could access the security footage of the property, and Nelson's father, who was there, reportedly said no until he talked to an attorney. Another key piece of evidence were the cell phones that deputies say belonged to Nelson and Tinney that they took with them. The internet activity of the victim in this story may be central to how this case plays out. Deputies say they interviewed Sophie's parents, who said that she had serious mental health struggles. They also said that their daughter, quote, had control over Lars and could manipulate him easily. Deputies then said that it was possible that Sophie and Lars had a pact to end their lives together, but Sophie's parents also say that Lars may have insisted that Sophie take her life. That line really stood out to us from Sophie's parents. What they told deputies, according to this affidavit, that Sophie had the ability to manipulate Lars Nelson. And that line is really important when I talk about the potential connection that this story in the Pacific Northwest has to a high-profile bombing that recently happened in Southern California. Less than a month after the shooting death of Tinney, a car bomb went off in Palm Springs, California. That explosion happened in the parking lot of an IVF clinic. Fortunately, all the embryos inside the facility were saved and only 1 life was lost, and it was the life of the bomber, according to the FBI. And this is that bomber, 25-year-old Guy Bartkus. In the wake of the bombing, we found a website that appeared to have a manifesto by the IVF bomber. The FBI said the bomber was anti-natalist, which is believing that creating life is wrong. At the top of the website, there was a link for people to watch a stream of the bombing, and he says it was his intent not to survive the bombing. The FBI said it did appear that the bomber was trying to stream that attack, but the bomber failed. But here's where the story that we're talking about in Washington State involving Lars Nelson comes into play, because under the headline of "What Finally Put You Over the Edge," the bomber writes that his best friend, Sophie, got the guy she was living with to shoot her while she was sleeping, her preferred method, and that he didn't think Sophie's death would impact him as much as it did. He also linked to several of her social media accounts, and there was this video that we found on TikTok.
So someone asked me why I'm antinatalist, and I thought I could give a little quickie on the reason that matters most to me. They all matter to me, though. Every argument matters to me a lot. It's just way too much information to get into in even a series of TikToks. But maybe I'll make more after this one. We'll see. I don't know. I made this account as like a around thing to kind of give my brain an off switch from this stuff. But like, I don't know. It is also something I enjoy talking about. I'll just give a quick run down on the main argument that matters to me, which is the consent argument, which goes basically, children can't consent to being born, therefore it's not really cool to do.
This was the username for that TikTok account, Veg Anti-Natalist. In the affidavit in Washington State, Sophie's parents said that she was an extreme vegan, and the affidavit also states that the night before Nelson allegedly killed Tinney, dispatchers received that call from someone who said they had been talking online with Tinney on the platform Discord, and her account on Tumblr had the same username, Veg Anti-Natalist. Now, Nelson was arrested 2 days after Tinney's alleged murder. The judge set his bond at $750,000. Nelson was able to post that with this bail bond. He is now free awaiting trial. Court records show a trial date in November for Nelson on the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Sophie Tinney. Join us now to talk about this case and where it goes from here is Joseph Scott Morgan, professor of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University in Alabama. Thanks for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. When you are going to a crime scene and there's this phone call that comes in and the caller says that it's someone who took their own life, as an investigator, what are some of the things that you're looking for when you enter that home?
I got to tell you, Chris, by the way, thanks for having me. It's not that I'm calling anybody a liar. I don't believe that anything is a suicide or anything other than a homicide until I can prove it to myself. Our underpinning as death investigators is the following: all deaths are homicides until proven otherwise. So you start at the very top, and that way, because, investigating a homicide, that material is very dense compared to, say, a natural death. So if you start off with the supposition this is a homicide, that way all of your bases are covered relative to collection of evidence, framing it, contextualizing it within the environment in which it's in, just thinking about the relationship of the weapon to the body, the injuries that you see at the scene. So if you move forward with the idea that this is in fact a homicide, and you try to prove that to you while your eyes on the scene, that's the most important thing. And I think that certainly applies in this case today.
Yeah, and so you get this phone call from Lars Nelson. He sounds very nervous in the 911 call, and then you get to this house. And one thing that stood out to me was that there were 3 entry wounds into the victim, and then there were 3 used shell casings in the house. And he had said that she, on the 911 call, died from a gunshot. What are some of the other kind of holes in his story that stood out to you as you kind of look through what investigators have?
Well, just going back to my own personal experience as a medical legal death investigator, I've had people over the course of my career in New Orleans and Atlanta that have shot themselves more than once. I've never had someone shoot themselves 3 times, which would be a real outlier for me. Many times you've got somebody that's advertising this as a suicide. And I always take exception to anybody, particularly a civilian, even a finder, in this particular case, that is telling me that this is a suicide. I much prefer somebody to say they may have shot themselves and this is a death. Let me decide if it's going to be a suicide or not. So it raises red flags with me. It almost feels like you're being sold on something, that they're trying to predispose you. So you have to be very circumstantially aware, when you walk in. With suicides many times, and just so you understand, most people in my field work far more suicides than you do homicides. As a matter of fact, in most jurisdictions, suicides outnumber homicides maybe 3 or 2 to 1. So it's something we're really adept at. You'll have people that will take weapons and test fire them before they self-inflict. That's a real thing, and it truly does happen. So you got 3 spent shell casings, you've got 3 defects in the body, which you don't really know if they're going to be entrances or exits, but you do know that they're defects and that they shouldn't be in the body, and they're probably generated by this weapon. You don't know that till you get back to the morgue. And therein lies the trouble if you assume that this is a suicide and you move forward and you don't do everything that needs to be done at the scene as far as examining the body, doing a spatial analysis on where the casings are, and certainly spatial analysis as it applies to the body itself. And what I mean by that is range of fire.
And when it looks at the entry wounds, what can the science tell you about whether the person who has the entry wounds was the person who was carrying the gun, or what tells you that it was somebody else who pulled the trigger?
Yeah. So that's where range of fire comes in, right? So let's say there's a classification that we use for self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Old school calls it hard contact, but you'll also have press contact. And that is if you have the surface, say the temple of the head, and most of the time, people that self-inflict will press the weapon very tightly to their head like this, okay? And as the weapon is discharged, you're not going to have any kind of soot deposition around that defect because everything is literally being blown in through that cavitated area. Now, if you take the muzzle and you move it back, say just half an inch, even that distance is going to give you an idea of soot deposition. And you can say that's close range, and you'll have bits of tattooing, which is like unburned gunpowder that literally embeds itself around. And the further back you move, Chris, from that point of entry, the more it spreads out. Kind of like the best example is if you think about a garden hose with a nozzle on it and you spray it and you don't have it tightened down and it kind of spreads out like this. It's kind of the same principle relative to gunshot residue deposition on a body. So the further the spread on the deposition, the further the range of fire you're talking about relative to the end of the muzzle as it relates to that point of entry.
I didn't read anything about fingerprints in the arrest affidavit, but I think of, and I hate using the cliche of like, well, in a movie, it's like this, but in the movie, when someone is trying to frame someone as if it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound, it's taking the firearm, putting it on the person's hand. If Lars Nelson, because he had access to this gun, he had his hands on it at some point, but if he was still arguing that this was a suicide, what can you take away from fingerprints when it is a weapon that potentially both people had held onto at some point?
Well, you can, not a lot. You can demonstrate that he held it, but if this were to go to court, like say, of course he held it, it was his weapon, or he had access to the weapon. But just to cover that base, and I'll give you a little insight here, with a weapon like this, that would go to the state crime lab, and they would literally, many times they're not aware that we do this, but people would literally take that weapon and hang it inside of it looks like a fish aquarium, and they would super glue it. That means that you heat up super glue inside of the fish tank. It's sealed with a weapon in it. And the chemical compound within super glue literally leaches on to the fatty lipids that are left behind with a fingerprint. And Chris, it freezes it in time. And so they're not going away, by the way, once it's there. And you can look and you can read every bit of what's referred to as minutia in the fingerprints that are left behind to give a specific identifier back to who touched this. You said that there were 3 spent rounds at the scene, so you've got casings. Technically, the casings could be fumed as well, but the real thing is going to be the magazine, because it sounds like if you have 3 spent casings, that's coming from a semi-automatic weapon. You take the magazine out, you super glue it or fume it. So you have all of these elements. Now, it would not be surprising if they're domiciled together that, both of their prints could be on it. That's reasonable. But again, you treat this as it's a homicide, and you want to be able to demonstrate this, because if they don't, that's something, if they move forward with charges on a case like this, that's an area that actually the defense can probe. It's an area to create reasonable doubt. Oh, you didn't even take time to print the weapon. It might actually mean nothing scientifically, but in front of a jury, it could mean everything.
Yeah, that's a really good point of things that might not be, for a pun, the smoking gun, but
right.
something that's showing that you did the due diligence. How difficult is it, have you found, if there is someone who commits murder, and Lars Nelson's been accused of that, to be able to trick the science or trick the investigators into thinking it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound? How hard is that, have you found, for someone to actually pull that off and get away with it?
It's very difficult. And if he's advertising this as a suicide, the biggest problem that you have is he's the finder, and there's allegedly 3 gunshot related defects in the body. That's just something that you don't hear of. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, because as soon as you say that something hasn't happened, it's happened somewhere before. But we have to face it. 3 self-inflicted gunshot wounds are certainly atypical. You know, somebody out there could say, well, an individual could shoot themselves in both feet. That's 2 shots, and then you've got 1 in the head. Most of the time, if you've got, like, let's just say that you've got 3 gunshot wounds in a critical area like center mass in the chest, or 3 to the head, that's something that you're doing to guarantee, in my opinion, that this winds up as a fatal event. You're trying to guarantee that you're bringing that much force to the circumstance to end this person's life. The big tell here, and the big piece of evidence, is going to be that range of fire. Okay, if he is allegedly holding this weapon away from her head when this weapon is discharged, that is atypical on the part of a suicide. Because if you think about an individual who has, again, temple, who in the world holds a weapon like this to shoot themselves? They want to guarantee that the weapon is like this. Now, the only other thing, and I think that this is kind of a thread that runs in the story, I've heard about that there was a chance that she allegedly has said, shoot me while I'm sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
That could be plausible, because if you can approach someone as they are in deep sleep and you press contact a gunshot wound, yeah, 1 time I'd say yeah, but 3 times I'm not buying it.
Well, and you bring up that point about her sleeping and or potentially sleeping when all of this happened. And I could see the defense where there were issues with her mental health, that she was somebody who apparently wanted to end her life in one way or another, and potentially got Lars Nelson to do that for her. When you see these cases and how they're tried, and if the defense goes for the sympathy of this is a guy who was just doing what his girlfriend told him,
Right.
and you know the science, you know how these homicide cases are tried, how could that play out in court, knowing if you have the science that can prove that he was holding the gun and he pulled the trigger?
In my opinion, and not being an attorney, I think it's going to be heavily dependent upon if you can get a sympathetic jury in this case. You know, if she's so debilitated, and, you know, for years, particularly when I was still in practice, we worked cases that were referred to as final exit cases, and they're based on this kind of infamous book that's out there. And final exit, people that believe in the philosophy of final exit, they call it self-deliverance. And it's like painless ways to take one's life. And there's any number of reasons that people do this. There have been people, a matter of fact, the writer of the book, I think his name's Derek Humphrey, he had prepared a tea for his wife that had meds in it, sufficient to the task of taking her life. She had like debilitating bone cancer. Is there any evidence that this individual, other than depression and suicidal ideation, had some kind of debilitating disease? Okay. If you're absent that, you know, and she's perfectly healthy in every other way, it's going to be really hard to sell that to the jury and say that this was, quote unquote, some kind of mercy killing. You know, I'm kind of putting out of her misery, because there's a lot of people that have depression. There's a lot of people that have suicidal ideation, but to have someone come in, pick up a handgun and shoot you in the head 3 times, I just don't know if that dog's going to hunt.
Yeah, no, when I read the 3 shell casings, 3 entry wounds in the head, it kind of just changed the way, if I was just looking at this objectively, whether Lars Nelson was telling the truth. What did you make of the connection, potentially? I mean, there's evidence that suggests that the connection is to this Palm Springs bombing at the IVF clinic that happened a little less than a month later. I think it's almost, and you've been in your industry for so long, that with the internet, and it's not the first time I've seen a case where you have people who have been linked to different crimes having communicated online and having a relationship. What do you make of that development in the story?
Yeah, most of the time when you think about narratives like this, you think about copycat stuff. This is not copycat stuff. You've got linkage here, at least in this narrative. Allegedly, there's something that the police are going to be probing and kind of picking at to try to understand those attachments in there. How is her name mentioned in this manifesto that was put forward by the Palm Springs bomber to linkage to this case up in the Northwest? Very curious, and they need to follow through, because this is my big problem with this, or my big concern, is that if this subject in Palm Springs was connected with her, I have to wonder, is there a network out there? Are there other people that have kind of, gotten on the train relative to, and forgive me if I'm wrong, the IVF, whatever, train here of, in vitro fertilization that I did not ask to be born. Right. That's like that's the moniker, that they've hung on themselves. How many other people have bought into this, and they use this as, I don't know, it sounds almost like an excuse to end their own lives. They're looking for some kind of justification to end their own lives. There's some kind of underlying mental health issue. People that are in this state of mind, Chris, are so fragile anyway and easily influenced. That's troubling. I'm wondering if there are other people that are out there that are linked to this guy in Palm Springs that have bought into this mantra.
Yeah, it's a huge concern, because I always think with the internet too, on one hand, we see cases where investigators are able to link things because of what you see online, and you have a better understanding of what potentially was going on in someone's mind. But then at the same time, I mean, in this case, it appears that certainly more than one person was talking about this ideology that was, I've never heard of this. And just what is your reaction to this? Is it antinatalism, pro-mortalism, which is just an interesting word gymnastics of someone saying that they never consented to being born. And it's concerning, because when you see of what the Palm Springs bomber did, that it's someone not only harboring this belief, but then trying to inflict damage on others.
I think back, and again, on a personal note, I think back to, people like myself that have lost children as a parent, and people that are struggling to conceive. And there's thousands and thousands of people out there that are going through this, and that he went specifically to this location for, where in vitro is facilitated. It's disturbing to me. Is this in a weird kind of way, in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, we had the attacks on abortion clinics, right? Well, are the in vitro fertilization clinics next? Is this the new horizon that we're crossing across because these people feel as though that they should never have been born? I mean, so the logic here is so twisted. But look, in the world that we live in now, nothing's beyond the pale.
No, well put. Joseph Scott Morgan, it's always great to have you on Law and
You
Crime.
bet.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.